Right now. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on Botswana Television.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you, Ulibile.
Right.
Mr. Samoka. Yeah.
Let's start a conversation by understanding the new development, the recent developments we saw at the war. It's been more than 10 days now happening between Israel and Iran. How is the development going on right now? Because we know that the US president did strike Iran. What's happening right now?
Yeah. Well, the political side is, as you use the word war, in the state that it is in, but it's not, in my ignorance, a full-blown war at the moment. I would still regard it as Israel-Iran conflict because it has not been reached the fully-blown war. I don't think both countries have mobilized fully as a war. But it is quite a worrying thing because the Middle East is the center of global oil supplies, so therefore it becomes a significant issue or tension to be very worried about. But then also the Middle East is interlinked with a lot of geopolitical regions, including Russia, including the Western side, the US and its allies. Therefore, what it then means is that it then quickly moves towards a global conflict because it then brings more and more players. It's very similar to during the Cold War era, where there was a war between UNITA and the Angolan government, which was supposed to be a local war, but because of the Cold War effect, it then brought the USSR, Cuba, and as you know, it then took more than 15 years to resolve that conflict. So therefore, the greatest risk politically is how it then balloons out and get more and more players interested. So if it could have been localized, I know I'm not answering your question, but if it could be localized and end up as a Israel-Iran conflict, yeah, it would possibly be managed better. But it does pose a risk, a great risk to global peace. And
most definitely. You earlier on highlighted the issue of oil supply. What potential risks do you foresee regarding oil and gas supplies as a result of the ongoing conflict? As we know, they've closed some, trade.
Yeah. The issue of oil supply, I would like to take a two-pronged approach to thinking about oil supply. Firstly, where do we place Iran as a supplier, both globally and then in the OPEC makeup of things? And then secondly, how does that affect global supply itself? So I'm saying this because sometimes we look at Iran as the supplier, and then we forget that when a conflict such as the Kuwait War, the first Gulf War, or Iraq War, the second one, when it balloons out, it then affects so many other players who are also suppliers. Then therefore it then becomes a global supply disruption rather than an Iran or whoever is a local supplier. That's the reason why it's going to have, it could have an impact globally if, like I said, it balloons out and spirals out to include other players. Iran is not a top player. Russia is, at least in the OPEC league, and then Saudi Arabia, and then Iraq, and then UAE, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and then these other ones. So what I'm trying to say is, if you worry narrowly about Iran, then you might conclude that maybe it will not have a global supply disruption. But if you worry about the impact that it will have on the rest of the Middle East, the problem is the alliances. So for instance, recently there were countries which were going to, other Arab countries going inside Iran to offer solidarity support and so on. So that's just the same argument I was giving, that the moment alliances build, then it brings more players. Politically, the big issue is whether the Arab League, as it did in 1973 and 1979, is as united. And then where, especially in the case of supply, if you link the geopolitics, Saudi Arabia will fall. And then, of course, in terms of alliances, the Saudi Arabia of 1973 and the Saudi Arabia of today are not the same. So therefore, the Saudi Arabia of today, if you look at global supply of oil, politically might be more closer to Egypt and therefore the United States. because of the religious conflicts amongst the internal conflict. But then the alliances are not yet clear right now, whether there will be an all-out anti-Israel Arab, Israel versus Arabs, or whether it is Iran and its allies. And Iran and its allies are not necessarily confined to the Arab world. There's Russia, and then Russia also has its own friends and so on and so on. So that's why it has a potential of spiraling out. But right now it's uncertain how it will affect supply. Like I said, if Saudi Arabia continues not to be inside the conflict, core of the conflict, then in terms of global supplies, we are sure that it is there. But then Russia as well is not really. You see some of these things, what you see people making overtones in PR is not necessarily what is happening in commercial contracts. So you may find a Russian company, oil company, has a long-term contract with a European supplier or receiver, and therefore may not necessarily, because what countries do at a political level, for instance, in the case of Apple, I know I'm digressing from oil to another product.
Yeah.
When an American president threatens China, it does not necessarily mean that an American multinational like Apple also joins in the fray. So a lot of times Apple will be completely opposed to what an American president. So I'm just trying to show that we shouldn't quickly conclude that Russian companies, in the case of supply of oil, will quickly terminate their long-term supply contracts.
All right, most definitely. Yeah. But we can see and understand that is already mentioned. The alliance is not yet clear thus far. But we know that some of the countries are aligned with Israel, or some of the Arab countries are aligned with Iran. But how might fluctuations in fuel prices, because we know it might affect, resulting from this conflict, affect consumer markets worldwide, and maybe zooming into Africa that are even struggling.
Especially those which are small countries which are just importers of oil without refineries. I think those are the most vulnerable, especially in poor African countries. Well, in Latin America as well, in Asia, where people don't have refineries, big ones like in our case, or we don't have strategic storage supplies, like what we have been trying to do for many years as Botswana. So these are the biggest risks to fuel prices. If you don't control supply and you are a price taker, like our case as a small importer, the big issue is that global supplies directly affect the import cost or the border cost, the port of entry cost, or so-called import parity price. So that's the price that is first affected. And then of course after that, the fluctuations and uncertainties, because the big issue in prices is our supply contracts setting, and supply contracts are actually ships coming to dock at the harbor. So therefore the big question is, if supply becomes uncertain, then price will fluctuate, reflecting that. And then those countries which are poor, like you said, their border port of entry prices will fluctuate the same way. Then what happens inland in terms of those it depends on your policy for managing fuel prices. In our case, we use mainly the NPF, but other countries use something else. Those which are more vulnerable to, or more open, let me say more liberal and more open to market prices, like the case of South Africa, closer to free market pricing, will fluctuate more with the fluctuation in supply. So, but others may be cushioned, like in our case. But again, also it's uncertain how far will be cushioned, to what extent, how long will that.
Okay, now let's step back in history. This war in the Middle East, we all know that it's not a recent war. It's been ongoing for years. Now, looking back in the context, how has it been, affecting the oil prices, the previous impacts on oil markets?
Well, there have been many wars between Israel and the Arab world. The 1973 so-called oil price shock was due to Egypt and Syria attacking Israel, as a collective, and then mobilizing the other Arab states to do the same in the so-called Yom Kippur war, the 6-day war. So it is possible that even today the history may replay itself. But like I said, the dynamics have changed a lot. Saudi Arabia is more integrated into the global financial system. Egypt has the largest, second largest stock exchange in Africa, more linked to the US dollar than before. So there are a lot of those dynamics which tell you that the Arab, that's the reason why when these things happen, you see a lot of uncertainties in the Arab world. Therefore, historically speaking, some people may be thinking that is going to be an Israel versus the Arab world as a unity, but to what extent is the Arab world, like I said, united against Israel? Because there is also the religious conflict between or intra-Arab conflict as well, plus the geopolitics that is surrounding the global alliances, plus the commercial contracts and financial contracts and integration that these Arab countries have with the US dollar as a currency and with the global markets. So these are complicating the war. So therefore the history is a lesson, but how much of a lesson is it?
Okay, because dynamics have changed.
Because dynamics have changed.
Mostly, you partly answered what I was about to ask about, Botswana being, we mostly going to be feeling the pinch, but there are those cautionary measures that have been put in place. But what measures can be taken to mitigate this adverse effects on global economy stability due to these tensions, more especially for African continent?
Yeah, like I said, Africa is 48 countries, 48, 52, depends on which ones you count and don't count. It depends on what macro policies each country is using, what trade policies, what exchange rate policies it is using, because also the exchange rate determines your purchasing power of the oil that you are importing. And then, but the critical strategic point, I would say, is how these countries individually and between them can leverage cooperation. If I may give an example of a speech recently by President Duma Boko, where he said he's ignited a refinery partnership, I think, with Namibia. Namibia or Angola, I think is Namibia, I forgot exactly what, but one of those two.
Yeah.
So that is a major trend which African countries ought to do. We should not have heroes like South Africa with a lot of refineries and others having nothing and no strategic partnerships between them regarding supply contracts. So therefore, in the case of Botswana oil, for instance, the strategic question is what are the long-term supply contracts that Botswana oil has? So that is what is going to tell us security of supply. In the case of Botswana, how much is the NPF being managed by Bera and the industry and the oil industry? So to us, that is what will matter the most. But cooperation in supply chains is critical, and then strategic reserves, I think, is also linked. We woke up very late, I mean, in terms of strategic reserves. So that's why we are still dreaming of building the Tsele, Rasesa Tsele, and then the Hansi depot. So, and then of course we have strategic one in Francistown. But of course, we have these integrated relationships with Mozambique, with Namibia, and COVID taught us a lot. COVID showed us.
Not to cut you short, but I was about to ask that why don't we have those strategic reserves? As you already mentioned, like we woke up during COVID and we learned the lessons, and it's like afterwards we were relaxing until this war that we're getting this shock. What should be done to make sure that at the end of the day we are not waiting for a strike or for something to happen so that we can now be awakened to come up with
it's a leadership issue.
Okay.
It's a leadership question. It's always about do you see ahead? Do you see 10, 5, 20 years ahead? Like the Tsele Hills project. This is a project that ought to have started in the 80s, the time when we had the money. We had a lot of money in the 80s. We stockpiled diamonds. Diamond prices went up. This is the time when we should have thought about these strategic issues. So it's all about that. Of course, it's never too late. But what I'm trying to say is each country, well, in our case, Botswana, ought to say to itself, what is the strategic position if I don't have a refinery? What do I do in terms of controlling oil prices? Because our old thinking was we have a strong currency, we have a product that is selling globally. But now see what is happening with lab-grown diamonds. The product is not selling. We are now in a crunch. So this tells you that someone should have, I mean, us as a nation, leaders ought to have then said, how do we protect ourselves, cushion ourselves into the long term? So these refineries and strategic reserves is something that we should plow into. If you know that you don't have control of, you are a price taker, you don't have control of supply chains. You don't have strong contracts. In our case, our contracts are with South Africa, who is also importing. It's not like South Africa actually produces anything. It's just that we are the second, third leg of their chain. They have found a customer, a willing customer who is always buying from them. But these refineries to them, they're also buying crude, and then they refine. So as we are just on the high end.
Far receiving end. Now, we are wrapping up this conversation in just 2 minutes. From an economic standpoint, what can businesses do to prepare for and respond to potential disruptions in energy supplies? Because at the end of the day, we're going to feel it.
Yeah. Well, there's uncertainty. Every good businessman knows that an uncertain world is not good for business planning, long-run business planning. So therefore, the risks are there for the war. No one knows where this war is going to end. So it's always good to be prepared at a business level in terms of your own reserves, cash reserves, in terms of your own corporate savings. How do you leverage it? Just like COVID, you know. That's just like when you find a global crisis in 2008, 2009, it turns out like that the world is uncertain. How do you survive that? How do you manage cost to maintain your operational costs so that they don't fluctuate or so that you keep them down? Not necessarily that you should cheat or do corruption, but how do you maintain cost and efficiency such that you don't end up being on the receiving end of rising, spiraling oil prices, especially for truckers, those businesses where transportation costs are a big factor in their cost outlays. So I think businesses can be cautious around that. But at a national level, the government should also be thinking in terms of how to deal with the price stabilization because the fuel prices are a key input in everything.
All right.
That we do.
Now we have to go to the 7 o'clock bulletin. But thank you so much, Mr. Nswaipe, for such insights.
Yes, thank you very much.
All right. Remember, I had in studio with me economist Edward Nswaipe joining the conversation, talking about the impact of Iran and Israel war going on, how it's going to impact the sale of oil and gas supplies, especially for the countries like Botswana and the whole of Africa, which is struggling. I'm coming right back with the 7 o'clock bulletin.
Let's raise our flag and cheer on our champions. Arvai Remuroko. Ola the Mez, Ola.